On this episode of Pilot's Discretion, we're joined by Jessica Meiris, a helicopter pilot and record-setting rock climber. She tells us about pursuing aviation as a second career, how safe helicopters really are, and what her favorite mountain peak is. Pilot's Discretion starts right now. Welcome, pilots. I'm your host, John Zimmerman of Sporties, and thanks for listening. 3 reminders as we get started. You can find show links and past episodes at sporties.com/podcast. You can email comments and guest ideas to podcast@sporties.com, and you can leave a review in your favorite podcast app to help other listeners find the show. Joining me today on the show is Jessica Meiris. She is a commercial helicopter pilot and flight instructor, flying the MD 500, AS 350, Robinson R22, 44, and 66. She works with the Helicopter Association International and the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But when she's not flying helicopters, she's also a very accomplished mountain guide, which we'll also talk about. Jessica, welcome to Pilot's Discretion.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So you came to aviation as a second career, and your story of how you got interested in helicopters is utterly unique. So tell us about that. How did you get interested in helicopters in the first place?
It is, and you can almost call it a third career. I actually was a marine biologist in college, never worked in that industry, but started in the oceans as an undergrad and then ended up guiding as a full-time career for 16 years. And my specialty was in rock climbing, and then switched to the skies. So I've seen it all at this point. And my path started with a rock climbing rescue. That was my first ride in a helicopter, happened in 2010, and my partner fell about 50 feet. I thought he'd broken his back. He had signs of head trauma and a few other scary things, and a helicopter was called, and we communicated to one rescuer that we were able to get ourselves back to the ground, so we didn't need to launch some high-angle rescue. I had the skills and equipment to get us to the ground, and they could meet us there, which they did, packaged him up in a litter, and this modified 500 came flying back into the canyon. There wasn't anywhere to land a helicopter in that tight space, and so the pilot put one skid down on this rounded rock outcropping, and one of the rescuers and my partner, now in the litter, loaded into this helicopter. Doors were off. The whole back was basically a big metal box with a bar attached to the side wall, which was the back of the pilot's seats, basically. And they clipped in, and my partner's head and feet were sticking out of the helicopter. So he was looking at the rotor system, his head out the door. And they took off. And I thought, okay, well, it's going to be a long hike for me out with our packs, and I'm assessing how I'm going to accomplish that. And sure enough, a helicopter comes back, picks up the other rescuer, and they invite me in. So I get to load up and go on this fabulous ride. And despite the gravity of that situation and how worried I was about my partner who was injured, I had the biggest smile on my face on that ride. And I thought, I compartmentalized everything. I thought, okay, there's something about these helicopters. I got to figure this out later and deal with what I needed to deal with right there in the moment. So I thought at the time I would maybe be the rescuer. I was looking at a career change. At that point, it was within maybe 10 years. I needed to change careers. I have a genetic joint disorder, so my days were numbered in guiding. However, I wasn't quite ready to make that transition, so I thought maybe I'd be the rescuer. And that would be my something with helicopters transition, but that doesn't really solve the physical issue. So later, maybe 5-6 years later, it occurred to me to maybe look at being a pilot. And after extensively researching the industry, I chose to go that route and started to put some steps forward in that direction. So like most decisions in my life, it was very practical. I needed a job that kept me in the mountains, ideally. I'd like to do mountain search and rescue eventually. Was physically much easier. I could sit on my butt more often, and mentally engaging, a place where you're always going to be a student. And helicopter pilot fit the bill. So it was by far the most expensive and by far the hardest of my backup career choices, but it was absolutely worthwhile.
Yeah, mentally active is one very good way to describe flying a helicopter. Never a moment's rest in that. I
Nope.
think it's interesting, though, that you're not one of those people who has wanted to fly since a very early age. We sometimes hear that a lot in aviation. Oh, I knew the minute I saw an airplane at 2 years old, I had to be a pilot. And there are plenty of people like that. But I sometimes think we do a disservice as an industry when we make it seem like everybody's that way. So, how did you approach flight training in the aviation industry differently, given that that wasn't you and this wasn't the fulfillment of some childhood dream?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. We do a disservice in aviation. It does portray that idea that we all have to, we're born with some passion for aviation and either you have it or you don't. And it absolutely was not that way. I didn't think at any point in my childhood that I would be an aviator. And aviation can mean so many different things too, from pilot to ATC to aircraft designer to airport management. There's so many different things. And that exposure, I think, is really important. So, how did I approach it differently? Well, like I said, the decision was quite practical. I needed my new career to fit these certain. I needed to check some boxes in order to have that be fulfilling for me because I know myself pretty well, and that was one of the advantages to joining aviation a little later in life. I know myself well enough. I know what I need, and I know where I'm going to fit. And there were so many barriers, and aviation, in a way, is challenging there because of things like cost or a medical certificate or time. And those barriers often stop people before they even look into them. And for me, all those things were there, and I was able to overcome them anyway as a result of the passion and the drive that aviation can really sink in. Once you get bit by that bug and you decide you want to pursue something like that, it doesn't have to be aviation, it could be anything, then buckle down and go for it. And there's no way around the fact that things are expensive. That's just how it is. So you either choose to do it and figure that out for yourself, or you find an excuse and you don't.
You've been open about some challenges with obtaining the second class medical. You mentioned a little bit of your medical challenge there. What's your advice for pilots who are navigating that process? Because that's something for people new to aviation, sometimes they haven't fully thought about as, oh, this pesky medical thing. What's your advice to somebody who's facing something like that?
Start early. If you haven't already started the process, start it early. And if you do encounter any hiccups along the way, then you have time to be able to manage that before there's the pressure of, oh, I've already started flight training and I need to solo, or I am running out of the time or the window that I've set aside for flight training. So if you haven't started that process, do it early. If you have started that process and you are encountering some road bumps, then reach out to people, start sharing. There's a stigma around medical certificates where people find embarrassment or shame around whatever their situation is, and they don't want to share, they don't want to talk to people about it. And utilizing resources that are available to you, whether it's a friend of a friend who's a doctor, or someone who has a great AME and they're willing to have a 30-minute conversation with you over the phone, or online resources, really flex those resources and start getting your story out there. And like most things in aviation, I've never found anyone in aviation who is not willing to step up and help. So if you put those intentions out there, people will show up, but you have to be the one to take that step. So flex as many resources as you possibly can to seek the guidance that you need. Otherwise, you'll continue to be stuck on top of that road bump and you won't get over it. So really flex resources and be willing to share your story with other people.
Great advice. Sometimes hard to do, but I think that's true. The aviation community can be really welcoming, and there's a lot of great resources out there. A lot of people have been through similar things. Let's talk about helicopter safety a little bit, a topic you've been working on a lot recently with the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team, HAI, other organizations. So airlines over the last 25 years have become incredibly safe, and business aviation has followed to a large extent, really improving their safety record. How are we doing in helicopters? Is the accident record improving in the helicopter industry?
It is improving, and the vision of the U.S. helicopter safety team is zero fatal accidents. And to break up that goal, that's a pretty lofty goal, but it's doable. We feel it's a reachable goal, but we need to break it up a little bit. So the goal in the short term, 5 years, is to reduce the fatal accident down to 0.55 per thousand flight hour. And the trend, if you look at, say, 20 years, has been going down. It looks a bit like a stock market profile. There's ups and there's downs and there's spikes and there's good years and bad years for fatal accidents. But overall, the general trend is downwards, which is really great. And there are some specific points in that chart where the helicopter safety team and other organizations have taken action or implemented some protocols or brought in additional resources for people or had a big education push where the line takes a noticeable dip. So what the team is doing, and aviation safety professionals in general, they're working. What they're doing is happening, and it's making a difference to force that trend continually down.
Sometimes helicopters only make the news when it's bad news. The Kobe Bryant crash, for example, gets it on people's radar. How much are we talking about with safety is the pilot versus the machine? In the fixed wing world, everybody likes to quote the statistic that the majority of accidents are caused by the pilot, not the airplane. Is that true? Is that the same challenge we have in helicopters, that it's mostly a pilot problem? Or do we have more complicated mechanical systems and there's something going on there too?
There's no doubt that helicopters are more mechanically complicated than airplanes. They're more challenging to fly than airplanes. So there's certainly a machine component. Overall, human factors is no doubt the cause of the majority of aviation accidents across the board, and helicopters are no exception. And the media does cover only the bad things that happen in helicopters and never the hundreds of thousands of life-saving flights that happen every day. And part of my mission with working in HAI and the US Helicopter Safety Team is to find avenues to get the positive information about helicopters out there to the general media. So talking pilot to pilot is one thing, and talking helicopter world to helicopter world, you're preaching to the choir. So instead, we need to get that information to a broader audience about how many flights happen every day and how many things that how hard helicopters work in the background to support your life every day, whether it's power and pipeline surveillance for the utility industry, making sure that power and natural gas makes it to your house, and construction opportunities, and of course medical flights and how many life-saving flights happen in that industry, ag spraying to keep your food coming to your house. There's so many ways that they operate in the background that people don't even think about, and those are the aspects of the industry that are never covered. And what's covered is the accidents, and it's sad. So I think the more that we can get the positivity about the helicopter industry out to the general public in particular, also to other people in aviation, the better.
Another example there that I find frustrating is as it relates to Robinson helicopters. I've got about 500 hours in R-44s, and I'd say once a year you read the story that Robinson helicopters are death traps randomly falling from the sky. It's been, I know, a very hot topic of conversation, especially in Australia, New Zealand. So you've flown Robinsons as well as many other types of helicopter. What do you think the real story is there? Is it just that they're popular and so they crash more often, or do you think there's something fundamentally unsafe there?
Again, we can tie that back to the human factors conversation. It is often about the pilot. We can't point that finger for every single accident, and we can't point that finger for every single Robinson accident. But human factors are a huge part. And we need to look at how Robinsons are being used. So, for example, the R-44, arguably the most popular civilian helicopter on the market, accounts for 10% of the registered and active US helicopter fleet and 25% of fatal accidents. And this is from a US helicopter safety team report, or excuse me, an FAA report actually, from a couple years ago. So the Bell 206, by contrast, is about 5% of the overall fleet and 15% of fatal accidents. So yes, just taking those two, obviously small picture example, but if we just take those two and contrast them, where are they used the most? The Bell 206 is widely used in all sorts of different things, from utility to tours, to construction and some medical even. But those aren't always the arenas where accidents are happening. The top three places, the top three fatal accident segments of the industry are personal private, instruction, and agriculture, ag spraying. So Robinsons are, and especially their R44, are a great helicopter for those applications. They're relatively easy to maintain. They're inexpensive to operate. If you're a small operator looking to run a business in any of those categories, or if you're a private owner, you're probably going to look towards Robinson. So it's important that we take into account where Robinson helicopters are being applied in the industry. And that does have a correlation to fatal accidents, but it doesn't mean it's all about the machine. Things are happening with other helicopters as well, like the 206. But those categories are important, and it's important to see that big picture.
Flying helicopters to me is the ultimate example of energy management. Altitude, airspeed, rotor RPM, especially in auto rotation, is what it's all about. So sometimes flight instructors talk about energy management, whether it's a helicopter or an airplane. Explain to us what that is, why it matters in a helicopter. What do you mean when you say energy management in a helicopter?
Sure. My understanding is it's fairly similar in fixed wing. I'm not a fixed wing aviator or flight instructor, but the principles are exactly the same. And the way I teach that to a student who's new to aviation is you have these buckets of energy, and the buckets are full when you're cruising around in flight. You have, in our case, rotor, RPM, altitude, and airspeed. And when those buckets are full and you're under powered flight and you're flying around and something happens, those buckets start to empty. Altitude, you're going to lose gradually no matter what. That's how it works. Things fall with gravity. So that bucket will be depleted gradually as you go. Airspeed, we can make maneuver inputs to control airspeed and keep that bucket as full as we can as the altitude bucket is starting to empty. And then you have RPM. For a helicopter, let's speak in terms of an engine failure. You don't have an engine anymore powering that rotor RPM like you do in cruise flight. However, you can still keep the rotors turning when you're in an autorotative state. The airflow is coming from a different place, but the rotors still keep turning. And control inputs, again, can manage that RPM. So now we have one bucket depleting, altitude. We have RPM and airspeed, which you can control with inputs. And yes, at some point, all of those buckets are going to be empty, but when you get to the ground. But how and when those buckets are emptied is what you as the pilot can control and manage. And assuming you have been trained appropriately and practice and you're proficient and all that, then you can bring a helicopter safely to the ground in the event of an engine failure without damaging the aircraft or killing anyone. So it's not the most, a full down real engine failure auto rotation with zero damage to the aircraft and zero injuries is not the most common outcome. However, it's possible. And there have been many, many safe auto rotations that have resulted in maybe some damage or maybe destroying the aircraft. They're just like cars designed to crush and bend to save the person. And everyone has walked away from those engine failures. So yes, it's possible. And that's how I describe the energy management component as it applies to a worst case scenario like an engine failure.
Yeah, the ultimate mental and physical dance there, keeping everything balanced.
You bet.
Jessica, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to ask you about mountain climbing.
Earn your pilot's license, get current, or add a rating. No matter what your goal is, Sporty's pilot training app will save you time and money. It's available on all your devices, including iPad, iPhone, Android, and smart TVs, so you can access Sporty's award-winning courses anywhere. Plus, with up-to-date sync between platforms, and free lifetime updates, you'll always be up to date. Over 25 courses are available, from private pilot to aerobatics. Visit sporties.com/discover for a free trial. Now, back to Pilot's Discretion.
We're back with Jessica Meiris, whose first career was in rock climbing, often of the very technical and even extreme kind. In fact, in 2014, Jessica, you were the first woman to rope solo El Capitan in Yosemite in a single push, which I don't even know what all that means, but it sounds pretty impressive to me. I'm always curious about the parallels between flying and other high-stakes activities. So is there a similar mindset for you between mountain climbing, rock climbing, and helicopter flying when it comes to, I don't know, risk assessment or planning or contingencies?
Absolutely. There are a ton of parallels. Thinking ahead and anticipating a situation, both, we call that in aviation staying ahead of the aircraft. And there's that same mentality in the mountain environment. Mountains are very dynamic, ever-changing environments. Probably sounds familiar. So is being in the sky. And that thinking ahead is critical, not only with the aircraft, or the developing situation, but also the people. If you're flying with passengers, you're flying a tour operation, you're flying with a team of medical professionals, whatever it is, being able to think ahead in terms of your crew's needs and bringing in that teamwork factor is also a huge parallel. You have to be able to be in tune with your environment and with the people, and then make decisions to set everyone up for success as the clock ticks. Time's not going to stop, so you always have to be prepared. High pressure decision making, absolutely. Keeping a cool head, maintaining composure, keeping other people calm in an emergency or in an intense situation, interacting with those people in any high risk dynamic environment. The mental and emotional capacity to keep all that together, step back, continue to look at the big picture as whatever smaller picture emergencies are happening at the time. And I think also the combination of technical skills and soft skills. So in aviation, that's your stick and rudder flying, and then the soft skills, the human factors, engaging with people. And in the mountains and mountain guiding in particular, it's the same thing. You have technical skills. Do I know how to get this person from point A to point B on a rope safely? And also, have they eaten recently? And how can we, I'm always in tune with, are they too scared? How can I adjust the way I'm speaking to them or the way I'm coaching them? Do they need encouragement, or is this too much? You're always reading those people and having that ability to read, decide, and then appropriately communicate the various steps to keep someone or a team safe in the mountain environment. Definitely applies to the aviation environment.
Between climbing and flying, you spent a lot of time in those mountains. What have you learned about mountain weather in those environments? Especially for a flatlander like me, what do I need to have top of mind if I'm flying out west?
Mountain flying should not be taken lightly, and I would not recommend that anyone flies in the mountains unless they've had some training, whether that be a mountain course that's provided by a school or someone you know who has experience and you can go out and learn from them and maybe be at the controls while they're coaching you. The mountains can raise the pucker factor pretty quickly. And I think if there are those of you who are listening who have been in the mountains as an aviator, it's probably the environment that you've gotten the biggest butt kicking. And they can be incredibly humbling. So education is important, experience is important, and having a healthy dose of respect for what those mountains can do and what they often dish out to the unsuspecting aviator. But there are tons of resources out there if you're interested in mountain flying, and some wonderful tips and tricks, even if it's just, hey, I need to cross a mountain pass and it's a small component of my overall cross-country flight. So what can I do? And some of those tips and tricks, like when you cross a ridge line, for example, you never want to do that at a 90-degree angle. You always cross a ridge at a 45-degree angle. Noticing the micro environment. There's trending big picture weather and winds. And then there's local small picture winds, which are changing moment to moment. Understanding that difference and then applying it and understanding that particular environment. How to read the winds when you don't have a flag or smoke or water or something are common wind indicators on the ground. What can I use? Well, sometimes there's moss that hangs off trees. That makes a great wind indicator. It's in the natural environment, something that might be overlooked. How can I feel through the aircraft? You have to know yourself and know your aircraft well enough to be able to feel the wind and how it's pushing you around in the mountain environment. So there's all these small nuances and idiosyncrasies in mountain flying that are critical to staying safe in those environments.
All right, Jessica, the last part of every episode is what we call Ready to Copy. I'll ask some questions on a wide variety of topics, and you give me your quick answer. Are you ready to copy?
Ready to copy.
What's a better helicopter, the A-Star or the R-66?
Oh, I love the A-Star. It has a special place in my heart, so I'd go with that.
Are factory training programs like Robinson's, Bell does some of this as well, are those worth it?
Absolutely.
How can we get more of those in the airplane world? It seems like there isn't a Cessna. I guess Cirrus is doing some of this, but would you recommend it for an airplane pilot if that's offered from the factory? Go do that?
Yeah, I would, especially for the segments of the industry where we're seeing more accidents, often in the personal private sector. If you can afford an airplane, then you can probably afford a little additional education. So definitely, I would recommend it.
Let's give airplane pilots some advice. How can you avoid potentially dangerous rotor wash when we're operating in the airport environment? If I'm an airplane pilot flying along and there's a helicopter operating, how do I stay safe?
Yeah, great question. That's a conversation that's gaining a little more attention and awareness these days, unfortunately, due to a couple accidents that have happened. So the dangers of helicopter wake turbulence can be huge, enough to flip an airplane, whether you're on the ground or not. And the take-home messages are 3 rotor disc diameters away from the hovering or hover taxiing helicopter. Sometimes that can be difficult to judge, especially if you don't know or are unfamiliar with the model of helicopter. But a couple hundred feet, 200 to 300 feet, will keep you relatively clear. 3 nautical miles of distance, aircraft separation between a helicopter, say that's landed or crossed a runway, and a plane that's looking to take off or utilize that runway for landing. So 3 rotor disc diameters, 3 nautical mile separation, and then 2 minutes of dissipation to allow those vortices to dissipate. So those are pretty easy to remember. 3 nautical miles, 3 rotor disc diameters for a moving helicopter, and 2 minutes of dissipation for that turbulence.
You used to coach a high school climbing team, so put your coach's hat on thinking about young people. What's one thing the aviation industry could do to attract more young people?
Advocacy and outreach, leading by example. Those 2 things. Advocacy, outreach, get into school programs, do presentations for young people. A lot of that's already happening. We need more and more and more. Be willing to step in to a high school program if you have kids or if you have your nieces and nephews. Anyone whose school is willing to host a 20-minute presentation from an aviator, or anyone in aviation, air traffic control, anyone in aviation, get the word out to those groups. And most schools would be happy to host you and have something different like that. So yeah, absolutely. And then leading by example. You as an aviator are representing the entire industry. Every action that you take has an impact in broader avenues. So lead by example. Don't be a jerk out there, and make aviation stand out as an industry that is full of good, passionate, hardworking people that are willing to share.
Speed climbing and helicopter flying are traditionally thought of as male-dominated interests. So how did you overcome that perception, or did you encounter any resistance there?
I fortunately did not encounter much resistance. I've always been attracted to sports that happen to be male-dominated. And I feel like, in general, I have not encountered much bias or resistance in that avenue. Most people have been incredibly supportive and helpful. And in fact, the only time I have encountered resistance in both aviation and speed climbing / mountain guiding, it's been from other women. And that was at the time very discouraging and caused me to pause and think about what's going on there. Who am I being to cause these people to react to me in a particular way when the perception out there is that women are supposed to be supportive of other women? So what's going on? And anytime that we encounter resistance like that or situations, especially with other people, one word of advice is to look at yourself first as you're looking at the situation. It's easy to point fingers. And also, there might be something out there that you have no control over. It's not your fault. However, also be willing to look inside and point the finger at yourself. Who am I being, or how did I generate that situation, or what responsibility can I pull from that? And it ties right back to the human factors piece with aviation. How can I be a different aviator to then prevent any accidents from happening when I have those little inklings, that little voice? If you're asking what little voice, that's the little voice. That little voice that's speaking to you always. So that's your guide telling you what to do and not do. And when we don't listen to those little voices, bad things happen. And it happens in mountain climbing and as well as in aviation. And that guiding voice is much wiser than our conscious mind typically. So always look at yourself and where you can carry responsibility.
What's your favorite peak in Colorado?
Oh, in terms of rock climbing, which Colorado is known for the 14ers. We have 54 peaks that are over 14,000 feet. And it's a big goal for a lot of people to climb all these peaks. And mostly they are steep walks in the backcountry. They're beautiful. And it's never been my go-to in terms of goals. I consider it more hiking than climbing. And so I'm attracted to places with big, tall walls, like Yosemite Valley. And in Colorado, there's a lovely canyon, national park actually, called the Black Canyon of the Gunnison. So it's not so much a peak because it's a 2,000-foot deep trench in southwestern Colorado, but it is my favorite place and in the state, and a place that I have spent countless days battling up the steep walls. And it's the tallest walls. It hosts the tallest walls in Colorado, 2,300 feet. So I would call the Black Canyon my favorite peak of sorts.
Our last question, always the same on Pilot's Discretion. You have one final flight. We want to know, what are you flying and where are you going?
Definitely flying the A-Star, my favorite helicopter. And I would follow the John Galt line. For some listeners who know of that book series from Ayn Rand and Objectivism, The Fountainhead and The Atlas Shrugged are two of her most famous books. And those books really shaped my life as a young person. I read them as a teenager. And so I would follow the John Galt line, which is a bit maybe less identifiable than some other answers that you've gotten, but that's what I would do. It's all about finding yourself.
Jessica, thanks for being on the podcast.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening to Pilot's Discretion, brought to you by Sporties, training and equipping pilots worldwide for over 60 years. For more episodes and helpful links, visit sporties.com/podcast. And if you have comments or guest ideas, email podcast@sporties.com. I'm John Zimmerman. We'll see you next time on Pilot's Discretion.